Yeah, and I would say that's like IB levels of like work. So like you're looking at like 100-hour work weeks, if
Wow.
not more. During that like month stretch, it's pretty intense. Criticisms on like how Carmine Corp's like roster is constructed before this current iteration. Again, probably super fair. The media's coding decisions, right? Or just like roster decisions in general. It's less about the decision, it's more itself than the process of like how you're communicating, what made you like lead up to making that decision that people have a problem with.
I sat down with the 100 Thieves general manager Junglejuice to originally do a 20-minute video talking about the day-to-day life of a general manager in the LCS, given that there's only 8 of them. But that conversation ended up being an hour long, so I'm just going to give you the full unedited footage of our entire conversation. Just do me a favor, drop a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you at the end of this for the discussion in the comments. And be sure to check out my other videos that will be on this channel, including 3 videos a week of LCS content and New York City watch parties. Follow me on Twitter for updates there. Enjoy the conversation. What was your pathway like to becoming a general manager in the League of Legends space? Was like this always your goal, or did this happen as a segue along the way?
It was definitely a segue. Like I don't think when I was a kid, like LCS didn't exist. So it wasn't like my dream one day is to become an LCS general manager. Um, I think my first dream when I was in high school, when like League of Legends, I was like addicted to the game and I was like grinding the challenger ladder, was like I want to be a part of this like league in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, when I was in high school and I was like grinding the game, I like hit challenger, like hit top 10 in one of the seasons in solo queue. I was like, hey, maybe I can become a pro player. Um, and then I was like in college, I had to balance out like, going to actual classes and like trying to be challenger, which is a lot of things that probably a lot of challenger players in like collegiate or high school can relate to. I struggled with that, so I was like, okay, well, I used to be like a math tutor because I did a lot of like SAT prep coaching when I was in high school. So I was like, let's just try coaching. Um, and funny enough, like one of the first teams I worked with was like Martin Shkreli. Like he's uh the guy that raised the price of like the AIDS drug by a huge amount,
Oh my God.
and
Yeah.
he went to prison. That was like, I don't know, that's a wild backstory that I tell people. But for some reason, that was like one of the first teams that I worked with. The team was called Turing, which was named after Turing Pharmaceuticals. Um, and then after that, I just basically worked a bunch of different esports jobs. I used to work at a agency called Flood, and that was an agency that used to represent like Valkyrie before like she became really big in like
Wow.
20, I want to say like 16, 17.
Yeah.
Uh, Yeah, but before that, I was just very like normal college student. Like went to college, was studying mathematics, did some CS, was working at a bank. It was pretty like I don't know, very like normal uh college I guess like route. And then I was just like so into League of Legends that I kind of just like dropped everything and just like decided to pursue it. So worked at Echo Fox with a bit, and then I think like 100 Thieves is really where I cemented my like career. So I first started off in this company as like I guess like an academy head coach. And the reason I got the job was because my old like gaming agency that I told you about, the boss used to be friends with Edward Chang, who's actually the um, I think he's like the VP of gaming over at Axis right now, which is like a crypto on-chain thing. But he was really close with Blake Robbins, who was our like the first guy that like kind of made 100 Thieves possible, along with Nate Shot. And I just like stayed in touch with him over the course of like 6 months before we even put in our franchise application. Um, and he knew I had like previous coaching history, so that's kind of how I landed it. And I consider myself to be extremely lucky because there was a very good chance that I would have been on like the Houston Rockets, like Clutch Gaming,
Yeah.
or because that was the other org that I was like very seriously talking to. So yeah, very very grateful to be here. But yeah, it started off with an academy coaching thing into an LCS coaching thing, um, And then yeah, you just kind of learn where your like strengths and weaknesses are. And I'm gonna be honest, like you need to have a pretty high emotional EQ to be a great coach. Like really understand where players are coming from, and while you need to be objective in your assessments of like what is right or wrong, sometimes it is just like talking to people and like getting them to agree with you or you agreeing with them or seeing eye to eye on certain things and like having really good conversations. And for me, it was always too much about the actual like right or wrong versus like how to actually negotiate good conversations. And uh, that's a very big flaw of mine. So when I worked with people like Tony Zix, like
Yeah.
who's like the Valorant head coach right now, we had like a really good dynamic because he was really good at that stuff. Um, but yeah, I think at a certain point while I was coaching, and this was like during Papa Smithy when he was GMing for 100 Thieves, it was just like uh, I got to a point in coaching where I was just like, hey, I'm not trying to discredit my own role here, but I just think such a large part of a team success is based on how the rosters are constructed. Like coaches have a if you think of like players as like a scorecard, like those like baseball cards on
Yep.
FIFA, it's like you have a 0 to 100 score normalized for a player, right? And if you give like an average score to a player, there's going to be variance depend on like the culture, depending on like how good the synergy is, like what the meta is. Like you're going to have like some deviation from like their average, right? I think coaches, you know, if they're doing a really good job, they affect that variance, right? But at the end of the day, there's going to be players with like higher averages.
Yeah.
And in order to be a championship team, you need championship players. And in order to, build a team with championship players, you really need to do a good job scouting and like building these teams. So I talked to like Tony and Chris about this for a very long time, but I felt like that was like a huge problem in our like pipeline. So I think it's the year that we started next. Um, I just started really honing in on like what is our current scouting procedures like? What is our current like methodology for choosing players? Like how are we scouting right now? How should we be scouting? Like what is important? And I just really tried to nail that down for a really long time. So I moved into like a scouting and analytics role um, after coaching because I just thought I could have a bigger impact there. And eventually our like system for like scouting and developing players became pretty good. And I felt like pretty confident with my hit rate. And then Jacob kind of saw that. So I've always had like a background in finance, so it was about combining that with like my current skill set, and that's how I became a GM. It was very much like a trial and error thing, and I don't think there is a pathway because it's a very niche role. Like this role just didn't exist years ago, so the pathway is like it's gonna be different for everybody. It was never my goal. It was more of like I think I can do a really good job at this, and I kind of grew into the role. And the reason I'm super thankful is because turnover in this industry is really high. Like there's coaches or head coaches that have like a bad year or a bad split, and they get replaced by someone else, whether that's fair or not. But I've had pretty bad years where like I've had ideas or suggestions on like whether it's rosters or my own coaching ability where I've made really poor judgment calls. Um, and I think John and Jacob still had faith that like on average I was making more decisions than good, or sorry, than bad. So they had a lot of faith even through the bad years. And that's kind of why I was able to build my current skill set. Because if I was like with another org, and I had like a bad year, like I would have probably kept switching through between companies. And I would have never been able to like kind of learn through this trial and error process. So that's something I'm really grateful for. And that was probably one of the main reasons why I was even able to find this pathway.
Damn. So now you're here. Now you're a
Yeah.
GM. You're one of only 8 in the league. What does Can you walk me through like what a normal calendar year looks like? That doesn't even like whether that's at season start, wherever you want to start it, just like the full progress of what 2024 or 2023 or any or even year any year in the future would look like.
So yeah, this calendar year thing, it changes so much because like the league has gone through so many drastic changes in the past 3 years. But obviously the busiest time of the year is the off season. So to give context on our 2023 rebuild, um, we just came off a championship team that got like second in both splits, and we're coming up with their like third year of their most expensive like contracts, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of it is just like working through your immediate priorities of like, here are the contracts that exist. How are we offloading them? What are we like? What is our budget? So like all of those things are pretty much already decided before the offseason even hits. So I would say normally the offseason free agency date is like November 20th, right?
Yeah.
So all the negotiations and conversations with players start like generally in October
Wow.
during Worlds, and even sometimes earlier, like mid-September. Because like you never, because like players they already have like where they're gonna go by like end of October, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to blindside players and like, oh, like you find out so late you don't have any team options. So a lot of it about this is doing this ethically, and that means like giving people enough time to like go explore free agency and have decisions. So if we consider like free agency the most busy period of the year in the calendar year, I would say like September to middle September to middle of October is like um, end of October by the latest is when you need to have all of your plans drilled down
Yeah.
of like, here's my plan A, plan B, all of our contingencies. And then middle of October to the free agency is like when you're doing all negotiations, reaching out to agents, reaching out to players, drafting contracts and all of that. And I would say, you know, a couple months before September is when you're constantly evaluating uh, all the players in all the leagues to like kind of come up with your plans. And obviously, like during that like September to October period, you need to be like fluid. Like you should have preset strategies, but your strategies are always going to pivot depending on like what becomes available.
Well,
Um,
that's what I was going to ask. How much does Worlds then, in theory, impact that? Because Worlds, you're like, if that's your timeline, you're throwing the biggest event of the year for so many of us, or at least from the fan point of view, right smack dab in the middle, and
yeah.
you're trying to figure out the next year while also trying to get out to quarterfinals and everything. Like that's got to be an impossible dynamic to balance.
Oh yeah. So um, for context, I was in Korea for like 2, 3 months this off season during Worlds, and partially it was for me to be in Worlds, but the other reason is because I knew the market was going through a massive change, and I knew we were going to be targeting some Korean players. So I was literally just working like around the clock, like working in Korean time zones, meeting with like Korean players, Korean agents, Korean families, um, and then also just working in US time zone, like connecting back with like our social marketing content team. So yeah, like that month it was like just absolutely crazy. Like there would be like days where I would just go without sleep, especially like that last 2 week period before leading up to free agency, because that time frame is just crazy. Um, but yeah, like those seasons, it's just like you can't. Sleeping is like a luxury. It's really difficult.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and I would say that's like IB levels of like work. So like you're looking at like 100-hour work weeks, if
Wow.
not more. During that like month stretch, it's pretty intense. But um, I would say like my experience is probably different from different GMs. For me, like a really big philosophy is like never leave a stone unturned, which is basically like even given the budget and constraints that I know that I have, I will never turn down a conversation, just because like you never know what happens. Um, like for example, like Jojo Pion, obviously, like I knew that like he was financially out of our budget, but like you still take the time to like reach out to his agent to like gather information, right? So yeah, a lot of it is just fun to do because collecting information and having an information advantage is like huge in terms of making great decisions. So you can make yourself as busy as you want basically at any time. Just because, yeah, a lot of this role is about making really good decisions about your program, right? And you need to be constantly like information gathering. So yeah, you can be busy all year round, but that period is definitely the busiest.
So when do you actually get to go on vacation then? Like, first and foremost, I don't know if you can say this or do you guys have unlimited PTO? Do you have like a set amount of vacation days you get a year?
It's like most tech companies where it's like
Okay,
unlimited
unlimited.
PTO,
Okay.
and it's like a use it or it's like a yeah, it's like a use it but like use it wisely kind of basis. I mean, like it's kind of there's a weird culture in tech around like unlimited PTO. It's like unlimited in a sense until like people are judging you if
Yep.
you use it. Um, yeah, my philosophy to the people that work with me and like myself when I take it is basically just like um obviously like I think people thrive when they're happy, right?
Yeah.
And I never want to take that away from people. So um I think just when it comes to this industry, just people just have to understand that it's the amount of work is very based on like which part of the season we're going through. So as long as they're able to appropriately get the amount of work done during those heavy like work periods, like I generally don't care. Like I don't care if it takes you an hour or like 10 hours to complete something. Like if you get it done in a reasonable amount, I really don't care. I'd hope that's like the philosophy of everyone else, but that's just personally mine. So yeah, I mean I haven't really had an issue with like people in our, like in my team taking PTO or anything.
I
So
also
it's
mean
been
for
pretty good.
you. I mean, you got to go on vacation every now and then, especially if you're putting in 100-hour work weeks. Like that's you
Yeah,
are asking for burnout. It's
yeah,
nothing if you don't.
yeah. I think whenever I go overseas with the team, I always like try to enjoy like that country because like traveling is a huge perk. Because yeah, there was definitely like a week in the off season after free agency period when everything was done. I just like completely took a couple days off. But yeah, I think there's also the aspect of like I want to find like the perfect balance before burnout in terms of how much work I produce because again, I know that this position is really privileged. Um, and just not a lot of people get the opportunity, and like I think we are in a position to empower a lot of change. So like not using that time wisely also feels like uh, a wasted opportunity cost. Yeah, just because it's an industry that like yeah, we've kind of everyone the community kind of built together. So I do feel that sense of responsibility, but I've gotten a lot better about like work-life balance as I've gotten older. Um, I'm sure everyone
Yeah.
goes through it, but I just think it's just really a dominating thing in esports just because people are so used to the grind. Um,
So then
yeah, it's
if you go
yeah.
into the regular season then. So once you've laid all the pieces out, you've done the hard work of the off season. What's the day-to-day like then when you're in that actual state where it's like, okay, in theory, you don't have anything more to change at that moment from a top point of view. What's your day-to-day like there?
Yeah, so day to day has shifted a lot. So let's go to like 2022 when we had like three teams, right?
Yeah.
When we had three teams, like our week, a lot of our week was structured around the competitive performance of every single team. So the conversations, it started off with like a weekly meeting in terms of like overarching goals, big things happening, and then we would like dive into each like vertical of that program. So whether it's like next academy or LCS, and then I guess like working priorities within each of those teams, right?
Yeah.
And then we would have like a calendar for like when everyone's matches are, and then we would like kind of try to keep touch in everyone's practice, and then a lot of it is just like operational of like when are the matches, anything we need to get done, coordinating with Riot, um, again coordinating with partners, content, whatever. Just making sure like those weeks are really fleshed out. So yeah, I would say when we had three teams, it was very operations heavy, and practice oriented. Like how can we improve practice? How can we make adjustments to our schedule? Here are like people that we're talking to when it comes to like sports enhancement, right? Whether it's like PT, how can we elevate the program to elevate our performance?
Yeah.
About like finding the additional 1% at the top. So that was like 2022. Um, 2023, when we knew that the league was going through massive changes, it was just like a lot of gathering data about like how much your team's spending, what is the average cost per win across like each of the orgs, like how much is EMEA spending, what is the current scene in like ERL, what is the current like state of things in ACL, a lot of just like reachers, a lot of spikes, and a lot of decisions, right? Because in 2023, uh, even after like the Bjergsen double lift roster, we also had to sign a complete new academy team, which we then dropped. We dropped our next team before that off season, and then we had to go through a bunch of roster changes because Soren like retired out of nowhere. So I would say like during the season, a lot of it is just like making sure things are like afloat. Obviously, we had a pretty poor performance in spring split, like the starting portion. So a lot of my time spent there was like trying to problem solve what was wrong with the team. And that's why we ended up making a coaching staff change, and then like we had like a pretty crazy run. But yeah, a lot of time was devoted there to like calculating the cost of like academy and our like output and stuff like that, which is why we decided to forego the program. But yeah, it just the working priorities always changes. So yeah, I would say because the role is still relatively new and the league has gone through so many changes, the calendar year has changed pretty drastically every year.
Gotcha. So then when you get up, you talk a lot about scouting, especially as you were coming up, uh, and like the general coaching, but like as a general manager in theory, you are exactly that management. You are overseeing people and delegating responsibilities and more in charge of growing the business and that side rather than like the day-to-day function of, how does, closer Bjergsen, uh, lane better against potentially Chovy or anybody like that.
Yeah.
Where does the balance lie as a GM? Are you like nowadays? We've kind of talked about the shifting of the business. Is it full on people management? Are you still in the weeds more as we see esports consolidate and staffs kind of shrink? Is that going back towards like one man does all? Like where's it at now?
Yeah. So the balance. I think the bigger your team gets, like the more control you have to be willing to give up. So when you're like a one-man team, you have full control. Um, and then when your team gets bigger and you want to scale, you eventually have to learn to give up control in order to achieve better things. And yeah, I would say a lot of it is just it's almost full people management at this point. Um, like I used to study the game, like watch every single VOD and like really understand like laning phase, which was like my specialty, like really to a T. And um, over the years, I've done less and less scouting, and now it's to the point where like I don't trust in my ability to make correct judgment calls on players anymore, probably after this year. So a lot of it now is just like empowering the new staff to understand like what our scouting archetype has been like in the past, like why we came to these conclusions, challenging them to make revisions based on like what they're accustomed to. So it's like slightly making changes year over year, still using the same system, but now like they understand the system and they're using the same systems like grade and score and scout themselves. Um, and that is just going to be a better system because, yeah, I can't stay in touch with the game forever. And there's going to be people that are going to be more well versed in the game than I am. It's just like an inevitable fact. So, yeah, a lot of it is more people management. In the same way, like it's like content. Like I used to be an avid fan myself, so I used to have ideas on like what content works, but content is constantly evolving. Like what works for my generation doesn't work with the younger generation. So it's about having like really core beliefs. But a lot of it is just empowering people that you trust to kind of put out their best work. So yeah, it's weird. A lot of it is like I had a very clear vision on like what I wanted the LCS to be when I was like a fan.
Yeah.
And then yeah, that vision has like kind of shifted over the years, and Now it's just about having a few core beliefs and then working within that open system where people can add ideas to it.
Gotcha. You talked about your hit rate earlier. You mentioned it.
Yeah.
Uh, Obviously, part of the job is trying to guess which players are going to work out long term, signing them to longer deals. Sniper is one that I look at now is like, as a fan, you look at that and it's like really happy that he's at 100 Thieves. Going to be really nervous when that rookie contract it runs
Yeah.
out and it's time to resign. But what I don't want you to mention specific players that you either hit or missed on, but like, can you talk about your hit rate and your like forecasting accuracy when you were doing that day to day?
Yeah. So I would say like a hit rate that I was completely off about was like Rikara.
Mm,
That was probably like one of my first signings. Obviously first year on the job, he was like the backup to Cody. Obviously there's a huge drama there. But yeah, like I don't know, there's a lot of ego when it comes to like scouting and player choosing, and I hope like I've had like enough self-awareness to kind of like reflect and change my ways. But basically like when esports was first evolving, there was a kind of like ruling sentiment amongst a lot of the coaches that wanted to enter the scene. Like I know better than you, like, and it's like a zero-sum game. So it was like people trying to eat each other alive, right? So if people ask me like who is the best player, like it wasn't developed enough to the point where like people could actually give or submit like a proof of work on like why they think a player is better, right? It's just like, oh, I know the game better than you, and when I watch this player, I just know that he's good. Um, so over the years, it took me a while to come up with like a systematic process of like how can we be most objective about this. Um, and like I said, that like light bulb moment was when like the year before 100 Thieves Next. It was like right after the Ryoma year, I think,
yeah.
where it was like, you know, it was evolving. It was like that Ryoma year, we were like, oh yeah, hey, our scouting isn't good. So how do we increase it? Hey, like let's start coming up with an objective sample size of games to actually watch. Like let's commit to that for each player instead of just like watching one VOD and making decisions. Um, Or how do we make it even more objective? So we started doing double blind. We started taking nameplates off. We started like we did a bunch of things. And eventually we got to a point where it was like insanely objective. But that like was like process of like trial and error. Um, so after that, like I mentioned Rikara, I mentioned Tommy. I would say like ever since that year, like we saw something in like Kemby and Tenacity. So I will take credit for that. I saw those players in solo queue went through the same scouting system. That was like when the scouting system was invented. And then I think Kelsey and Tony were basically like, yo, well, Tony was basically like, I've ran an amateur team before on CLG. And then Kelsey kind of helped pick the rest of the players. So that's when like Poob and like Jan, who was our mid laner? Copy,
Yeah.
right? That they were added to the mix, and that was like our first iteration of Next. And again, the hit rate on all of those players is extremely high. You think about like our academy rosters from that Next program, that hit rate was like crazy,
Oh my
right?
God. Yeah.
So um, I would say like we in terms of like the last 3 years, I think we've had the highest like um, academy to LCS promotion hit rate in the league. Just because like those like 2 years of like Next and Academy were so successful. And I would say like even our hit rate this year has been really, really good. Um, so yeah, even like I think players like Tenacity, for me, it's less so about a hit rate on his like skill individually as a player,
Yeah.
but more so like the cultural and like factors outside of the game that made it so that he didn't succeed as much as we wanted him to. And that's really the reflections I've had in the past 2 years, where it was like, hey, like I reached a almost like what felt like a nirvana like state when it comes to like the stat profile and the mechanical profile of players you want to target, but I'm not really indexing hard enough on like the outside environmental cultures and like what shapes people.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to focus a lot more on that in terms of like how do we need these players to think, like just not in the game, but like outside the game itself. So that has never been a strength of mine, and I think it's something that I'm thinking a lot more proactively about now. And I think that's like one of the reasons why Grayson has been like a good addition because he likes the systems that we work within because he's been a part of our program. Or like I worked with him when he was on academy, and I helped him build his academy rosters when he was working here. But he and I were always very different in the sense that he had a very like humanistic approach to players, where I had like a very like analytical approach. So for me, it was just like when I see a player, it's like they're like in their face, it's like they're just like numbers, you know.
Yeah.
And then for him, it was just like, oh, what is this guy's story? How many hours does this guy practice? Like what do I see? Like, yeah. So his approach is a lot more humanistic.
He's looking for the
So
intangibles.
yeah, so just getting more insight from him has been like pretty valuable. I still don't think it's like a make or break because like I could like sign Gandhi and that doesn't mean he's going to be a great League of Legends player, you know? But when we're talking like at the top of the top competition, like those little adjustments do make the difference. And I would say like we've hit the high strides in most of our players because of those cultural factors. So um, yeah, I don't know where the question started, but we ended up
No,
here.
no,
So
it segues it perfect because the thing I was gonna ask on top of that then is like, say you identify somebody, you identify somebody that has both the numbers and say Golden Glue has like says that he has the intangibles. What's the pitch look like to ownership or leadership to get these through? Because I'm assuming that it's not as simple as Junglejuice wants to sign a player, Junglejuice is going to sign a player. You have to get approval from somebody to sign off on the budgets, to sign off on how much it's going to cost, what you're working within. What does a pitch typically look like to them? Is it just an open conversation? Is it that 2 hour board meeting where you got lines pointed everywhere that you're still figuring it out? Like,
so yeah, everything's pretty systematic in terms of a calendar year. So like by the middle of like the year, probably around July or August, when summer is already around, like I'm already making judgment calls on players with the coaches. Like I don't talk to the coaches about it because there's a weird dynamic, right, where I need the coaches to help scout the players at the end of the season, but I don't want them to have in the back of their mind this player is getting replaced or anything like that because like they're in coach mode. They're not in scouting mode. They're in this player is the best player in the world, and I'm gonna make sure I see that through.
yeah,
Um, so I'm making my own judgment calls on like what I think will happen with like what our options are with each player. And in like July, I'm already like submitting like I guess like action items to the board of like here's our current roster. Here's my recommendation on each player, whether it's like retain, renew, or like drop or trade, whatever. And based on that decision tree, I have already like B, C, D, E, F like roster iterations already presented to them. Because at that point, I know the budget relatively. Because July and August is like that's when like Q2 is already wrapped up and like we're like doing Q3 forecasting and then we know like what our estimated like we're basically doing our like 6+6 or our like 9+3 right around that time. But the tricky thing is you
real quick, can you explain what 6+6 is or 9+3 is? Because I
yeah.
know, but not a lot of people that
Yeah,
don't
so
work in
it's like
finance.
we like 6 months have passed. Like we talked about like our actuals versus like what we've budgeted for in the first 6 months and like what's left in the next 6 months. Are we gonna hit our budget targets or not? And then yeah, 9+3 is like we um assessed our like, actuals versus budget for this 9 months, and then we're forecasting the next 3 months.
Okay.
And these are just like practices that we do to make sure we're on target for the year. But the thing that kind of is iffy about that timeline is like partnerships usually they start talking to sponsors about 20 like for example 2025 deals. Those conversations are in the woodworks right now, but they don't get finalized until like August, September, October, sometimes even November, right? They don't like get fully signed until then. So I mean, I'm sure you've seen like OAM and G2's like financial reports, but a large part of the business is actually revolving around sponsorship. So you don't even know how much money you have in certain off seasons, and it's hard to commit to a budget because let's say you get like $5 million in sponsors. Like, how does that get attributed across the org? Like for a team like Sentinels, if you get a $5 million sponsorship, okay, it's like going everything Valorant like adjacent, right? Like whether it's like Valorant content, Valorant socials, Valorant apparel, whatever. But for us, we're like a lot more complex of a company. So if we get a $5 million sponsor, just like hypothetical number, right? Is that going to help the peripheral business? Is that going to help other esports? Is that helping like grow like socials content, whatever? So we have like conservative and like liberal budgets, right? Like so sometimes I'm given like, hey, this is like worst case scenario, this is the budget you need to stick to. This is best case scenario, have roster iterations available for this. And that's why the due diligence is kind of necessary. Like that's why I said don't leave like stones unturned, because
Yeah.
like there's been cases where like, for example, with like Doublelift and Bjergsen, like that wasn't the roster we were gonna go to for. Our roster that we were actually going for that year was like Unforgiven. Um, yeah, it was going to be Unforgiven as our LCS AD carry. Um, and that's actually why we signed him, and that's why he ended up playing Academy, because we actually landed Subway in that same time frame, along with Peter and Soren. So you kind of see how like a lot of the decision trees get impacted by a lot of things not that's directly with the game, right?
Yep.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of how we do that. And then as we get closer to the season, like probably every like week or 2 week cadence, I'll have like roster proposals. Like, here's this like 5-man roster. Here's like their cost. Here's their value projection. Here's how much I'm negotiating. Here's like their market value. Here's like what the average cost per the role is. Like here's like my recommendation, and then here's like a brief note on like why we should be signing this player. And like it makes it super easy for them to like, it's like basically a deck of like, here's product number A. Like if
Yeah.
you consider a team a product, and it's like you just compare all the different product iterations until but yeah, usually when you present it to them that way, it's really easy to like, I guess, like tell them your strategy behind each decision,
Yeah.
and the budgets are already agreed upon, like constraints are already talked about. So it's pretty easy to present it that way, and then everyone's on the same page about like why we're doing what we're doing. So that's been the process, and I think it's been pretty effective. Um, Obviously, there's always like room for improvement, but that's what the process is
Yeah.
like.
You got to kind of take the punches as they come. There's only so much you can plan for at the end of the day. Reality happens in very mysterious ways. And
Yeah.
you can't plan for
Um,
everything no matter how much you try.
yeah, just to like talk a little bit about like Dignitas, I think that's like an interesting GM or like work to talk about right now with all the roster changes. I guarantee you they could have made these exact same changes before Summer Split even started, or Spring Split started. Like if I had a gun to Bakery's head, I don't know if he would say it, but like if you had the choice to like make these exact roster decisions before Spring Split, he probably would have. But probably a lot of the things came down to the fact that they made commitments to like XU or these other players.
Yeah.
And for me, like I fault them more on that than anything else, because when you think about it, it's like obviously you can't plan for the inevitable, and like stuff like GGS or EG getting dropped from the league is like stuff that happened very late into the season. But like, for example, XU, I know a lot of players like him, or like the community likes him a lot, but you have to be pretty objective in like how you slot player projections. So we have something called like a board, and it's just like, every team in the league, what their prospective like budgets are going to be. Again, that's the information gathering part, and then exactly like what the GM intends on doing with each player, because that information is important. Like, for example, River, first all pro player, and you tell me like, give me stats on like what the average jungler was paid this split, right? or this year or whatever. And then because he got first, like his value proposition, like purely from a statistical perspective, it has to be really high, right? But then you actually get to the weeds of it of like, oh, these teams already have commitments to XYZ player. There's only like these many slots available for this player. Now the pricing becomes a little bit more complicated, right? And that's, I feel like, an exercise that like I feel like a lot of GMs are failing to do. And I think that's like why we've been able to price players so well for the past couple of years. Like our championship roster, for example, we were like middle of the pack when we won.
Yeah.
Even though like that FBI and like closer deal was like insanely high of a buyout, right? So like that's like my criticism there is like if you're a team that doesn't have the highest budget, because usually when you have the highest budget, it's just like get whoever you get, like you have the first choice, first dibs, like everyone's kind of just it's a waiting game for everyone else,
Yeah.
right? But if you're a team with a lower budget and you don't have first pick on any of your like draft picks, you need to have a good idea of like what players other orgs are going to go after because you need to know what the theoretical remaining pool is, right?
Yeah.
So my question to Dignitas is like, first of all, if like Spica and XU were to be available, would you have chosen Spica before Spring Split started, or was it more so a thing of like XU not working out? I'm more inclined to believe that it's like they think Spica's a better player, right? So you wouldn't have been forced to make that decision if you did a better job of like slotting which junglers people are going to commit to. Because there's like TL was never going to sign XU. Like it didn't fit their
Yeah.
profile. C9's never going to sign them. All these other orgs were never going to sign XU.
Yeah.
Like from my perspective at least, from my information gathering, right? So it's like, what is the point of making a early commitment there? Um, Obviously, it's a lot about like rapport building, but and yeah, there is like a benefit there. But for me, from a objective standpoint, it's like you're just pigeoning yourself into a direction that you don't have to pigeon yourself into, right?
Yep.
Because you're in like the driver's seat, you have that flexibility. So for the player, it's like obviously it's going to be a waiting game, it's going to be torturous, but you have to do your due diligence there. And I think that's the same problem that Immortals ran into with Castle. Like I think Castle played great, but there was like something on Reddit about like why didn't they just sign Licorice? Because Licorice would have played for any team for any amount of money. And I know for like I don't know for a fact, but I saw someone commenting from Immortals or something that like, oh, we already made this commitment to Castle and
Yeah.
the timing didn't work out.
And
And it's
I
like,
think Shopify put
okay,
out a similar statement because they signed Fake God. And people were wondering why not Licorice over Fake God. And similar
yeah, and
situation now with
yeah,
Fudge sitting at the wayside at C9.
yeah, and it's the same reason. It's because they made a commitment to a player and they don't want to do ethically wrong by these players after they make like a verbal commitment because none of these players are signed.
Yeah.
But my question again, it's like I'm not asking them to be unethical. I'm asking you to reflect on like your process of like why are you committing to these like who else in the league was going to sign Castle? No, nobody.
Nobody.
So why are you making a commitment to this player if you like know that you're in the bottom hole of like draft like order? Like you need to be flexible and like really get the timing right because again, if they had a decision between Licorice and Castle before Spring Split, they would have chosen Licorice. Like I fully heartedly believe that. So um
Other leagues wouldn't impact that, or because like I'm trying to like think in my head like devil's advocate of like how would he respond to that. And the only two things I could think of in my mind were, yes, in theory there's nobody else from the LCS that is going to sign him, but there might be somebody from a different region. And I'm not a GM, I don't know how much other regions impact it. And then the one with Speaker was like, I know Travis has mentioned it in a video or two of what's either his buyout or what does his contract look like? Because he signs with FlyQuest as a content creator, but what does that inhibit his ability to go to Dignitas? And that's not even including like whether he wants to go to a team like Dig.
no, I think again the FlyQuest thing was also timing. It's like people expected Speaker to stay on that team until they signed Inspired. So again, that was because like Speaker was kind of surprised too.
Yeah,
I don't know if you saw that tweet. So Again, a lot of it is timing, and then yeah, when it comes to Castle, again, it's purely just information gathering. Like if you watched Mask and followed Mask and Castle's story, it's like Mask went to an ERL team and did pretty well. But if you understand like LCK, CL, and like the LCK ecosystem, you don't need to make decisions that quickly unless they're like the most contested player, like Thanatos or Pulbay. Um, because like here's how LCK CL talent works. It's like if you're an LCK CL player, you have like immediate tier one priorities. Like your immediate priority is getting picked up by the top LCK teams or the top LPL teams because LCK is super polarized,
Yeah.
right? Like LCS was pretty competitive, but in LCK you have like Genji, T1, like just like these super strong teams, and then you have like Hanwha who has like really increased their budget to try to break into the top four. But then you see every other team and they're like 5-13 or something like ridiculous, right? So there's a lot of polarity in that league, and the talent is pretty stacked. So as an LCK-CL player, it's like the salaries in LCK-CL aren't that good. So you want to get out of LCK-CL, especially like as you hit your 20s, because like Korea's ageist in their challenger scene is like a lot more predominant, just because there's so many younger challenger players.
Yeah.
So you start hitting this like timeline of like when you need to make your tier one entrance. So for them, like if they can't get into a LPL or LCK team, then joining EMEA or LCS becomes their like number one priority over like, you know, another LCK CL team. So yeah, I just think it's lack of like information to make decisions like that. Obviously, like I don't have full context, but I'm pretty confident in my like assessment there because that's pretty much how we operated because we were in very similar positions. But we didn't make any commitments like that, and we were in positions to sign players like Licorice or um, Spica or whoever because we knew like we just planned so far in advance basically.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the information gathering is so important because it's not like it, yes, obviously it's like a decision tree of yes or no on players during that free agency period, but there's just so much context that leads up to the decisions um, like throughout the year. So I think that would be my like criticism or like reflection point is like never put yourself in a position where you're having to make a hard decision like when those decisions come
Yeah.
because you've already like made the decisions beforehand basically.
I'm curious then. I mean, the hardest decision that I can think of, like in maybe in 100 Thieves League history, barring like I wasn't around for 2018, 2019, so I don't know
Yeah.
everything that happened then. But the Ssumday Tenacity situation from the beginning of last year, where it was like, at least from the outside in, like this is the fan perspective was Sniper is sitting there. You know he's probably going to come in fairly quick, if not first year, almost immediately afterwards. The thought process for many was, why not hold on to Ssumday for as long as you can and just wait it out? If like it would, my dog is literally dying in the background apparently.
Yeah.
If you're, it sucks to lose Tenacity, but when you have Sniper in the wings, in theory, like that's your play you're gonna go to. So why then get rid of Ssumday, or not get rid of Ssumday? He was a free agent, so he could sign wherever he wanted. And in theory, I'm assuming the bag was probably offered by EG to take him away, which prevented that. But why not try to keep him, send Tenacity off, and then just usher in the Sniper era as Ssumday retires afterwards?
Yeah. So again, like the goalposts changed a lot from 2022 2023. Like 2022, we knew like we were going to be a top three team. Worlds is the goal. 2023, we're doing a completely new rebuild. Um, and obviously, gold like Worlds is like a reach goal.
Yeah,
But I didn't have the same confidence level. Just because like new staff, new group of players, even if the players are talented, like there's other very other strong teams in the league with pre-existing synergy. So when Worlds is no longer like a locked goal, but like more of like a reach goal that we're like striving to push for, your decision making changes a little bit there. And you also have to understand, like I said, a lot of decisions are based around like how much information you have, right? Sniper was not a for sure bet for us. Like even leading up to this year. Like I go on a lot of interviews around like General Sniper about like the narrative around him is great. He's super young, like generational prodigy, whatever. But internally, you hear me and the coaching staff say like, dude, this guy was hard stuck in Diamond in Korea. Like, are we sure about this guy? Like, let's look at the numbers. I'll look at X, Y, and Z. It's like he's promising, but he's not like a for sure bet. And like, as much as I love narratives, because like it's a great content and social play, like for me, competitive success is like still like a top tier priority, right? So I'm not going to like make roster decisions based on like what is just like sexy as a product. So yeah, our confidence in Rayon's growth was there, but like, is he gonna get there was always a question. Um, and for me, 2023 was kind of an experiment where I needed to see what Milan would look like in the LCS when he started. Because yeah, for me, it's like our championship window just closed. I need to figure out how to open a new one, whether that's like in 23 or in future years. And top lane is where we have the most amount of assets, and I need to actually understand and test which of these assets are going to lead us there.
Yeah,
So it was an experiment that was necessary because um, Tenacity was always a super promising player as well. And until they actually play in the LCS stage and then you actually get to see what they can offer in that like pressured environment, you will never actually know. You can have really strong convictions. You can have like there's going to be players that like will succeed for sure, but you won't always get the clearest picture. So that's kind of why we had to run the thought experiment with top lane.
gotcha. That's just something I was always curious about because after there was the whole like 6-man team back in 2022 prior to Ssumday just having almost I don't was he an MVP finalist that
He
year?
was top two All Pro, I think.
I knew he was top 2 All Pro. I thought he might have been considered for MVP for some reason, but he just popped off absurdly well in 2022.
Yeah,
That it was like, okay, Tenacity never got the time. Fine, nothing you can do when a player has like an insane season like that. It just is what it is. Uh,
yeah, and I still think like Milan's story is quite sad. Because I mean, there's like things in his control he could have handled better, like the cultural things or like how he carries himself like outside of the game. But also, it was just like you see players like Busio. He just hit like first All Pro in support, right? And obviously, there's still like struggles that he has on the international stage, but like our conviction rate on him was like so high, even though he wasn't like performing his first year with Peter at times. So it's like things like that where like um yeah, they're like experiments you need to test out if your conviction is strong enough. Um and I would say like that's probably some of the reasons why we don't see orgs promoting certain players is because like conviction levels aren't high enough.
yeah.
Because like they're all risks. Actually, this is like why I try to be super self-aware and reflect a lot. Is when we first built Next, one of the mid laners we were actually considering was APA
Mhm.
because he's really close friends with Kenvi.
Yeah.
And Kenvi was like vouching for APA, and we chose like copy over him. And made that decision because I looked at APA's profile as a player, and he did not fit the archetype of what I was looking for. He was at the time mainly an ASOL TF like moving player. He didn't know how to play mages. He didn't play anything mechanical. So for me, it was just like, wow, this was like a really strange player. Where his like strength is like his ability to like push and move and like play for the team, which is like a very coachable aspect. But in terms of like his laning or his mechanical prowess, it's like not there. So this isn't like the archetype I'd like to think that's on. And then obviously he went through like the whole collegiate ecosystem. He still is like has the same problems. He's very much a team player. Uh, very much plays those champions still, and he's not going to be your Akali Silas like mechanical prowess player. But I mean, he is like an epitome of like someone that like like through pure work ethic alone has like proven my convictions like wrong on him as a player, and like to me that's always interesting to see. Because yeah, even if like you have a system with like a really high hit rate, there's always going to be things that like go through the cracks. Um, So I look at that and it's like, wow, there's still like a bit of learning to do. Yeah.
I've taken so much of your time, so let's speed through these last two questions so I can send you on your
Yeah.
way. First, what's the most common misconception about being a GM in the LCS?
Hmm. I don't think there are misconceptions. Like, I think recently GMs have gotten like a lot more flake in like the past couple of years. Like before, I think if players don't perform, it was just like, oh my God, a lot of people flaming players. And then I think the Reddit narrative at a certain point was like shitting on GMs. Like, how can I blame the player? Like, of course, like if someone hands me a paycheck, I'm gonna take it even if I suck. That's the GM's fault. And honestly, that's pretty true. Like, if you're a player and like you get a coveted spot in the LCS and like someone is paying you to do it, it's like, is it really your fault? Like if you were a bad player that gets offered the job? No, it's like whoever hired you did a really poor job hiring you. Um, I would say a misconception is like I just think like roles, responsibilities is just like it's probably so different across like each org. Like for a bakery as an example, like people are giving him shit right now, but like I don't really know his like in and outs on like what he does on like Dignitas. Like he's also like the VP of esports there, and he's probably managing multiple titles. So like you can like discredit their like socials or content or whatever, like whatever aspect of their business that you think it can be doing better. It's like he's a GM, but at the same time managing these other titles. Does he have like the workload to actually focus on socials and content? Is that like does he have like the capacity to fit that as a part of his like working priorities? Probably not. Um, so the misconception of like what their roles actually entails, I think, is a misconception because they will all make roster decisions for the most part, but maybe in a certain org, like it's the head coach making decisions and the GM is just like taking cover for them, right?
Gotcha.
So I just think like clarity on like what GMs actually do is just like still very unclear because it's a new industry. Um, I guess like to make this a little bit more interesting, like what are common misconceptions that you commonly see, and then maybe I can address some of those.
I don't. I just wasn't sure if there's anything that like I wanted that question to kind of just be a chance, like if there's any narrative that you've seen that you felt like, okay, like people, come on, like that's not how this might work. That's not like you've seen unfair flame directed towards whether that's your job, other people's job in the same role. Like I haven't really seen anything that I didn't think was fair necessarily, but I wasn't sure if you saw things in a different light. So I just wanted that to be kind of like an open ended chance to correct the record on stuff.
No, I think all the community criticism is actually super fair, and I think again, there's been really high turnover for a lot of coaches and GMs or whatever, so a lot of people just have to act out of self-preservation. So it's like hard to be have the privilege to be aware of your own like shortcomings at times, right? Like if people are criticizing you for decisions, it's much easier on your psyche to be like, oh, these people are just trolls. Like there's internet people, don't listen to them. It's way easier to handle it that way versus like, oh, there's like a truth of this. Like I felt short when it came to this decision. So yeah, I think most of the community criticism is fair. Um, like when you are like saying, hey, why aren't we doing more socials during this international event? It's like very easy for me to just be like, oh, this isn't like this doesn't fit under my bucket or umbrella. So it's just like, I'm gonna continue doing what I'm doing. But I think like we'll see more progress if you take that criticism and you're like, okay, why isn't this happening? Here are the reasons why, and like how are we gonna fix it? It's like we have to be a lot more open about like how we handle criticism too, because I think there is a lot of truth to it. Because with players, it's just like, yeah, they're in charge of like their own performance. But for GMs, whether the criticism is directly related to you, you're in a position of power where you can delegate those problems to the people that can actually fix it too, right? So I just think that's why we're always in a position of power to fix like pretty much anything within our like realms control. So I think the criticism is super good. And at the end of the day, if you can't do anything about it, you can't. But most of it's fair. Like you'll see like people being like, why didn't we do a social post on this? Why didn't we do a content post on this? How could you treat your players this way? You could have your reasons, but like, yeah, they were probably right. Like, why didn't you do that? Like I know for us, like for example, uh, like when we released Closer, and people were like, "This is it. Like, this is a social post, like a
Yeah.
goodbye post." And it's like, yeah, this wasn't executed well. Like, and whether that like is my fault or whatever, it's just like, well, at the end of the day, it's like I should have been a part of a conversation of how this should have rolled out on a calendar or timeline. So, yeah, I think whenever the community has like criticisms about how things are handled, um, it's usually pretty fair. And whether or not I agree with their sentiment, usually a lot of it is more like process. So, like even like the media's coding decisions, right? Or just like roster decisions in general, people, um, it's less about the decision, it's more itself than the process of like how you're communicating, what made you like lead up to making that decision that people have a problem with.
Yeah.
So for me, I see it less of a decision-making issue and more of like a criticism to how in touch we are with our communities. Um, so yeah, I think honestly, I think all the criticism is pretty fair.
Interesting. Seems like the general perception I've got is that the community is very good at identifying problems. Very good at it. Not
Yeah,
necessarily the best at implementing the solutions, especially when you're dealing with organizations that have political structures that you have to go through and chain of command, which is not always the easiest. You got suits that you have to deal with, etc. Like
yeah,
the problem solving is different than identification of it. But the community at
yeah,
a minimum, they see a fire, they call out a fire pretty quick.
yeah. Like again, I think it's fair. Like Bo from like Carmine Corp is a great example, or like criticisms on like how Carmine Corp's like roster is constructed before this current iteration. Again, probably super fair, very, very fair, because even when it comes to like player criticism, it's like this is something that I find so funny. It's like when you're a coach, right? And I'm a GM and I'm asking a coach about like a player, so much of their perception is judged on like their work ethic, how they've improved, like what they see like idealistically in the player, like how they are in practice. And then all fans see is like how this player performs on stage. And you can say like the coach's perspective will eventually translate and you should like trust the process, but for a large amount of cases it's like if a player is unable to perform on stage, like those outside intangibles do not matter until they translate, right?
Yep.
So people will like, I think Targamas was one of them, and like Carmine Corp, it's like, yo, this guy is not performing, and then you like watch his games and or whatever, like, and it's like as a GM you have to at a certain point like prioritize certain things. So I think the way they handled that situation was super weird. And I kind of agree with them, like letting go. Again, I don't have full context of like, yo, is this actually like Yamato did something super weird in the coaching staff? All the players actually didn't like him, and this is just like a PR stand, and then like Casey is doing the right noble thing by like taking the PR hit for their coach.
Yeah.
Like that could be a possibility. Like with Immortals, like I remember Sharks got cut, and like people were pissed that he got cut, even though like they had a lot of potential. I voiced that too, but honestly, I voiced that a little too strongly. I probably shouldn't have done that. But for them, it could be the same thing, right? Like where this coach maybe did something crazy, or none of the players actually like this guy. But players obviously don't want to say that about their coach. They don't want to say that about their coach. And then maybe the coach was just really bad, and like he's able to be the good guy on socials because the organization doesn't want to come off poor. So I do think like there are certain situations where organizations can't release full context, and that means they just have to be the bad guy sometimes. But for a large majority of situations, I do think there can be a little bit more transparency without like being like a rat, right? Of like, no, actually, like we're the good guys. This guy was the crazy person. Like you don't want to do that because you don't want to set that as a precedent of like how you treat current, future, or like former employees.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes you can't tell the full truth, but can we do a better job of communicating? Absolutely.
Gotcha. Well, we've I've had you on here for an hour and 20 minutes. Anything else you want to say before I cut this off?
Oh no, it's just like I don't know, I'm just like super grateful again to like the team here for like letting me like fail upwards in some sense. I don't think a lot of people get that opportunity. Like we see turnover all the time. Um, and yeah, I guess like for people looking to be a GM, I don't have like a clear answer on how to get there. Like there's people that don't have any league background that like make their like way into this role. There's owners that become GMs. There's like I don't know. It's like everyone's pathway is like different. So yeah.
I'll offer a bit of advice there. Everybody should work to grow the game of League of Legends. That way we can have 10 teams and 2 more GMs in there. That way there's more job opportunities so we're not taking anybody else's.
Yeah, I would say like outside of a GM, like some I guess like knowledge that like Jackson, who used to be a really big part of the company, like left
Yep.
with me was like I think when you're younger and you're like still trying to figure out what you want to do, a lot of it is like so objective focus of like I need to make this much money or I want to be this person or be this role. And I think a better piece of advice that has worked out for me is like really find your niche, find like what you find interesting, and eventually like hopefully it'll take you somewhere. Obviously, like the conditions in that are like different. I need to find a niche that works, but um, yeah, I think you don't have to spread yourself too thin. Like if you have really high conviction in something, you should just like really focus on that niche. And the world is such a vast place that you will find like a target audience that you will be able to reach. So I just thought that was really cool.
Cool. Thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time, man. I really appreciate it.
yeah, no problem.